and 5th grade. This is Mrs. King, and I am in our classroom right now. Notice our anchor charts are falling off the walls here. But I wanted to just go over some things about fractions with you. And we're going to first take a look at adding fractions, and we're going to chunk adding and subtracting fractions together just to kind of make this a little shorter. I know a lot of people may not have access. I know myself. At home, our internet is very limited where I live, so I'm going to kind of try to make this as short as I can, but also helpful if you need any help, okay? So when adding or subtracting fractions, the first step is you have to have a common denominator. Your denominator is this number that's on the bottom. So for example, this first problem, 2/12, 12 would be a denominator, and 4/6, 6 is your denominator. Notice they are not in common. They don't have anything in common. That is not the same number. And so first step is we have to, in order to add or subtract, we have to have a common denominator. So how do we do that again? We have to find the multiples of those numbers. Find the least common multiple to come up with your least common denominator. It's always easier to work with smaller denominators. So when we look at 12, when we list multiples of 12, 12, 24. When we list multiples of 6, 6, 12, notice the least common denominator would be 12. So we don't have to do anything to 2/12. The only thing that we have to do is we have to change 4/6 is equivalent to how many twelfths, and that's step 2, is set them up as equivalent fractions. So we have to say 4/6 is equal to how many twelfths. If you remember, all you have to do this step is say, how do I get from 6 to 12? What do I multiply 6 by to get 12? And that would be 2. And whatever I'm doing to the denominator, I must also do to my numerator, and 4 times 2 gives me 8. And so now I'm ready to add those two fractions together. Step 3 and 4, I chunk them together, is just line it up and then solve. So 2/12 plus 8/12 gives me 10/12. Now if you wanted to reduce that fraction, you could call it 5/6, or you can simply leave it as 10/12, okay? Just like we said before, it's kind of like saying 2 apples plus 8 apples is 10 apples. We don't say 10 bananas, so that denominator does not change. 2/12 plus 8/12 is 10/12. I'm going to do one more problem with adding fractions here. Let's take a look. Let's pick out letter C here, 3/5 plus 2/10. Notice they do not have the same denominator, and so I need to come up with the least common denominator, which would be 10, thinking about multiples of 5, 5, 10, thinking about multiples of 10, 10. So my least common denominator would be 10. And now I have to make these equivalent fractions. 3/5 is equal to how many tenths? Well, how do I get from 5 to 10? Multiply it by 2. Whatever I do to the denominator, I must do to the numerator, and 3 times 2 gives me 6. Okay, 6/10. And add that to 2/10, and my answer would be 8/10, or the same thing as 4/5. Okay? Let's move on to adding mixed numbers. So take a look up here. I'm going to move on to the next page. I'm going to go ahead and write these vertically. I always shared with you in class that just because something is written a certain way doesn't mean you can't change that. So 1 3/8 plus 3 1/4. If I'm taking a look, this is called mixed numbers because we have whole numbers and fractions. So the first thing we still need to do is, are we working with like denominators? No. Okay, so I need to come up with what would be my least common denominator, and when I look at 8 and 4, I know that least common denominator would be 8, so I don't have to do anything to 3/8. It stays 3/8. All I have to do now is change 1/4 is equivalent to how many eighths? So 4 times 2 gives me 8, so 1 times 2 would give me 2. Making sure I put my whole numbers back there. This now is 1 3/8 plus 3 2/8. Now I'm going to take and add my fractions together first. 3/8 plus 2/8 gives me 5/8. And finally, take a look at those whole numbers, and 3 plus 1 gives me 4. So my answer is 4 5/8. Let's take a look. Moving on to the next page is subtracting fractions. So same steps, okay? Step 1, find equivalent fractions. Step 2, subtract the numerator and use the same denominator in your answer, just like I said before. When you say apples and apples, you don't change that to the bananas. So 4/8 minus 1/4, our common denominator here would be 8. We don't need to do anything to 4/8. All we have to do is change 1/4 to an equivalent fraction into eighths. So 1/4 is equal to 4 times 2 gives me 8. So whatever I do the numerator, I'm doing to the denominator. Really what I'm doing is taking that fraction and multiplying it by 1, because 2/2 is the same thing as 1. And when I multiply anything by 1 or divide anything by 1, it doesn't change it. 1 times 2 is 2. So 4/8 plus 2/8 gives me 6/8, or I can simplify that to 3/4. Okay, adding and subtracting fractions. Same steps every time. Do we have common denominators? Set them up as equivalent fractions, line them up and solve. One more is subtracting mixed numbers. Same exact steps. Starting out, find the least common denominator. When we look at 8 5/8 and 4 1/4, least common denominator is 8. I don't have to do anything to 8 5/8. The only thing I have to do is change 1/4 as how many eighths. 4 times 2 is 8, so 1 times 2 would give me 2. Make sure I go ahead and tag my whole numbers there. 5/8 minus 2/8 gives me my 3/8. And finally, 8 minus 4 gives me 4. So my answer is 4 3/8.